Hey guys, tonight we're stepping inside the most revolutionary room in American history, and it's not the Oval Office, it's not Independence Hall, and it has absolutely nothing to do with powdered wigs. It's the grocery store. Specifically, we're talking about how the American supermarket quietly rewired the way families ate, shopped, fought over dinner, and eventually forgot what a vegetable was supposed to taste like. Not the farmer's market with its artisanal goat cheese and passive-aggressive kombucha. The real grocery store, fluorescent lights, waxy apples, and a cereal aisle so long it has its own weather system. Now, before you get too comfortable, first, a sincere thank you. Tonight's topic came from a viewer suggestion, and I just want to say that kind of input genuinely shapes what this channel becomes. When you take a second to drop an idea in the comments, it matters more than you know. So if you've been lurking, considering hitting subscribe, please do, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And if this puts you to sleep in the best possible way, leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is. Also, we're now live on Spotify, so if you'd rather drift off there, the link is waiting for you in the description. Now, dim the lights, put a fan on if you've got one, pull the blanket up, get horizontal, you've earned it. Because before we go any further, I want you to think about something. Have you ever stood in a grocery store aisle at 9:30 on a Tuesday night, holding a can of soup, completely unable to make a decision? Did someone in 1953 design that paralysis on purpose? Why do eggs live in the back of the store? Who decided that fruit-flavoured and fruit-containing could mean completely different things? What happened to the neighbourhood butcher, the corner bakery, the milkman who knew your name and your mother's opinion of your father? When exactly did TV dinners become acceptable? And could you, a fully functioning adult in the 21st century, actually survive a week cooking the way your great-grandmother did, from scratch, from memory, from whatever was in season and not yet grey? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1946. The war is over, the suburbs are being built, and somewhere in California a man named Sylvan Goldman is about to change everything with a shopping cart. You don't know it yet, but your entire relationship with food, what you eat, how you buy it, who cooks it, and why dinner is both a comfort and a source of low-level family tension, is about to be redesigned from the floor up. Good luck. And maybe grab a cart. Before the supermarket existed, putting dinner on the table was a daily project that required planning, relationships, and a very good memory for what the butcher had left on Friday. Most American families in the early 20th century bought their food from several different specialists. The grocer, the butcher, the baker, the produce stand, each visited separately, often on foot, often every single day because refrigeration was limited and food spoiled fast. There was no weekly haul, no cart overflowing with a month's worth of ambition. Eating was local, seasonal, and deeply repetitive. You ate what grew nearby, what your mother had learned to cook, and what your budget allowed, which, for most working families, wasn't much. The idea of walking into one giant building and choosing between 47 types of bread was not just impossible. It would have seemed faintly unhinged. So picture your great-grandmother on a Tuesday morning in, say, 1918. She knows the butcher opens at 7. She knows the bread from the bakery 2 blocks over is best before 9 because after that it goes to the restaurant on the corner. She has a mental inventory of what's in her kitchen that is more precise than anything you've ever kept on your phone. Because forgetting an ingredient doesn't mean a quick detour on the way home. It means the whole meal doesn't happen. This is not nostalgia. This is logistics. Daily, domestic, unrecognized logistics performed without a list app, a car or a refrigerator that does anything except sit there being cold. The neighborhood grocery store of that era was not a self-service operation. You walked in, you told the man behind the counter what you needed, and he fetched it. This sounds charming until you realize it also means he knew exactly how much you were buying how often you bought it, and how close to the end of the month your purchases tended to get a little thin. The relationship between a family and its grocer was genuinely intimate, and not always comfortably so. He extended credit when things were tight. He knew your husband's name and your mother's health and the approximate state of your finances without ever being told directly. The corner store was a social institution as much as a commercial one, and the transaction of buying food was layered with obligation, familiarity, and the quiet exposure of how a family was actually doing. Meals themselves reflected this narrowness in ways that would seem almost monastic today. Monday was one thing, Tuesday was another, and the rhythm didn't vary much from week to week or year to year. Bean soup. Roast on Sunday if you could afford it. Leftovers. Monday. Something with eggs on Wednesday because the chickens had been productive. Vegetables from the backyard garden in summer. Root vegetables from the cellar in winter. And a general understanding between the cook and the calendar that you worked with what was available rather than what you wanted. The concept of craving a specific thing and then going to get it did not yet exist in the way it would once the supermarket arrived. You craved what was in front of you, or you craved nothing, because the other options were simply not on the table. What's striking, looking back, is not the deprivation, but the competence. The American home cook of 1920 could take a small, plain collection of ingredients and produce something nourishing, filling, and reasonably good without a recipe, a food processor, or 45 minutes of anxious YouTube preparation. The knowledge was simply there, inherited, practiced, and unself-conscious. The supermarket would eventually offer abundance beyond anything those cooks could have imagined. What it would slowly take away, without anyone quite noticing, was the quiet confidence of knowing exactly what to do with what you had. The first truly self-service grocery store opened in Memphis, Tennessee in 1916, and the man behind it, Clarence Saunders, had an idea so obvious in hindsight that it's almost painful. Instead of handing a list to a clerk who would fetch everything for you, what if customers simply walk through the store themselves and pick things up? What if the product and the shopper met directly, without a middleman, without conversation, without the gentle social pressure of a man who knew your name and your usual order? Saunders called his store Piggly Wiggly, a name that meant nothing and somehow meant everything. And when it opened, customers lined up around the block just to experience the novelty of touching the merchandise before buying it. What felt like freedom was actually the beginning of something much larger. The slow, steady transfer of grocery labour from the store employee to the customer, who would do most of the work and feel good about it. The Piggly Wiggly experience was, by all accounts, slightly bewildering the first time through. You entered through a turnstile, you were given a basket. You followed a single, prescribed path through the store. Saunders had designed it as a loop, forcing customers past every single department before they could reach the exit, and you selected your own items from shelves that were labelled with prices. This last detail was genuinely revolutionary. Before self-service, prices were often negotiable, or at least variable. The clerk quoted you a number and you either accepted it or you didn't, and the number might be different for you than for your neighbour, depending on how the clerk felt that morning and how long you'd been a customer. Fixed, visible prices on every item democratized the transaction in a way that felt almost radical. Everyone paid the same. You could see exactly what things cost before you committed to buying them. The mystery was gone. What was also gone, though nobody said this at the time, was the conversation. The clerk at the counter had been a source of recommendations. He knew which cut of meat was fresh that day, which brand of flour his other customers preferred, which canned goods had arrived that week. He was a filter, a guide, and occasionally an editor of your purchases, subtly steering you toward things he knew were good and away from things he knew were not. The self-service model replaced all of that with a shelf and a price tag and the expectation that you would figure it out yourself. This was more efficient, certainly. It was also lonelier, in a way that would only deepen as the stores grew larger and the staff thinner. Saunders was not humble about the scale of what he'd invented. He expanded Piggly Wiggly aggressively, franchising the concept across the country and eventually operating more than 2,000 stores. He built himself a mansion in Memphis. Locals called it the Pink Palace, and began construction on an even grander home before a series of financial misadventures ended both the building project and his control of the company. The Pink Palace is now a museum. The Piggly Wiggly chain still operates in parts of the American South, the name still bewildering, the turnstiles long gone. But the logic Saunders put in place in 1916, walk in, find it yourself, pay a fixed price, carry it home, is so completely embedded in how we think about shopping that it's essentially impossible now to imagine the alternative. The conversation that used to happen at the counter is just gone. You probably don't miss it, because you never knew it was there. The 1930s did not produce adventurous eaters, they produced efficient ones. When the Depression hit and millions of families found themselves stretching every dollar until it nearly tore, American home cooking became a masterclass in subtraction. Fewer ingredients, smaller portions, more creative use of things that previous generations might have thrown away. Lard was a cooking fat and a flavour. Oatmeal appeared at breakfast, dinner, and sometimes both. Bean soups, cornbread, and whatever garden vegetables the backyard produced became the foundation of the American table, not by choice, but by necessity. And yet something quietly remarkable happened inside all that scarcity. Families got very good at feeding people. Recipes were memorized not because it was romantic, but because paper was expensive. Skills were sharpened. Waste became almost unthinkable. The Depression pantry was grim by most measures, but it was also ingenious, and it planted habits that would linger in American kitchens for decades, even as the stores grew larger and the options multiplied beyond anything those lean years could have imagined. The flour sack deserves its own moment of recognition here. During the Depression, commercially milled flour came in large cotton sacks, and manufacturers, understanding the situation with painful clarity, began printing those sacks in floral patterns and cheerful colours because they knew the fabric would be repurposed. Dresses were made from flour sacks, children's shirts, curtains, pillowcases. If you're wearing a garment made from the same material that held your breakfast ingredients last month, you're operating in an economy where nothing is wasted and everything does double duty. It is efficient in a way that is genuinely moving, and also slightly horrifying if you think about it too long. Meals during the Depression were built around what food historians call extenders, cheap, filling ingredients that made a small amount of expensive protein go much further. Breadcrumbs in the meatloaf, oatmeal in the burger patties, extra potatoes in the soup, dried beans cooked for hours until they were soft enough to be the main event rather than a side dish. The goal was satiation, not pleasure, though pleasure appeared sometimes anyway because good cooking is stubborn like that. Depression-era cookbooks, which did exist and circulated widely, offered recipes with a matter-of-fact tone that was almost heroic. Here is what you have. Here is what you can make from it. Here is how to do it without wasting the pot liquor. What the Depression also did, less visibly, but just as powerfully, was create a generation of cooks who were deeply suspicious of abundance. The women, and it was almost entirely women, who learned to cook during those years carried those habits long after the economy recovered. They saved bacon grease in cans on the stove. They used every part of the vegetable. They made soup from bones. They were constitutionally incapable of throwing away a heel of bread. Their children, raised in the relative prosperity of the post-war years, found these habits either admirable or slightly embarrassing, depending on the decade and the dinner guest. Their grandchildren, raised in the full flower of the supermarket era, would eventually rediscover bone broth and day-old bread in artisan bakeries and call it something new. The Depression pantry was not a lifestyle choice. It was a survival strategy that became a set of values, then a set of habits, then a ghost that haunted American kitchens long after the shelves had filled back up. When the supermarket arrived in earnest, those habits would slowly be dismantled, replaced by abundance, convenience, and the novel idea that you didn't have to be clever about food if you could simply buy more of it. In 1937, a grocery store owner in Oklahoma City named Sylvan Goldman watched his customers struggle to carry their baskets and had a thought so practical it's almost embarrassing. What if the basket had wheels? He took a folding chair, attached 2 wire baskets and a set of wheels, and created the first shopping cart, a contraption so ungainly and unfamiliar that when he introduced it to his store, customers refused to use it. Men thought it looked weak. Women thought it was reminiscent of a baby carriage. Goldman had to hire actors to push carts around the store just to normalise the sight of it. But once it caught on, the shopping cart did something nobody had fully anticipated. It allowed people to buy more than they meant to. The basket on your arm had natural limits, weight, discomfort, common sense. The cart had no such constraints. It just rolled forward, getting heavier, getting fuller, silently suggesting that there was always room for one more thing. The American grocery hall was born and the supermarket would be built around it. Think about what the handheld basket was, functionally as a purchasing tool. It was a budget made physical. When it got heavy, you were done. When your fingers started going numb from the wire handles, you were done. Your arm told you the truth about how much you'd picked up in a way that your brain, dazzled by shelves and prices, sometimes failed to. The basket was honest. It did not flatter you or encourage you. It simply got heavier until you took it to the register, and the weight of it was, in a very direct sense, the weight of the decision you'd made. The cart replaced all of that with wheels. Effortless, rolling, morally neutral wheels that registered no opinion about how much you were buying and required no physical investment whatsoever. You could load 40 pounds of groceries into a cart and push it with one finger. You could add things without subtracting them. You could circle back to the chips aisle after you'd already passed it without the penalty of reorganizing what you were carrying. The cart was not neutral. It was optimistic by design. A vessel that always suggested it could hold a little more. Goldman understood what he'd created. He patented the cart design aggressively and licensed it to stores across the country, becoming extraordinarily wealthy in the process. He lived to 95. The man who made it possible for Americans to buy more groceries than they planned to died a very contented multimillionaire, which seems entirely appropriate. The modern shopping cart has evolved considerably from Goldman's folding chair prototype. Carts are larger now, noticeably, deliberately larger than they were in the 1980s, because studies found that a bigger cart led to more purchasing. Child seats were added, partly for convenience, and partly because a parent who can keep a child in the cart moves through the store more slowly and with more attention. Some carts have cup holders. Some have small screens. The fundamental mechanism, though, a wheeled container that holds more than you need and requires nothing of you physically, is exactly what Goldman invented in 1937. He solved a problem that his customers didn't know they had, and in doing so, created a different problem that the grocery industry has been profiting from ever since. After World War II ended, America went on a building spree that reshuffled the entire country. Suburbs spread outward from cities at a pace that astonished even the people building them, and the families who moved into those new houses brought with them new cars, new appliances, and new ideas about how domestic life was supposed to work. The weekly shopping trip became an institution almost overnight. Instead of buying a little every day from neighbourhood shops, suburban families, most of them owning a car and a refrigerator for the first time, began loading up once a week at the new, larger grocery stores that were opening on the edges of those growing communities. The supermarket and the suburb were co-created, each making the other possible. You needed a car to reach the store, you needed a big store to justify the drive, and you needed the store to make suburban life feel complete, stocked, managed, and ready for the week ahead. What had been a daily errand became a weekly ritual, and the ritual gradually shaped everything about how families thought about food. The post-war suburb was a new kind of place in American life, not a city and not the country, but something engineered to be both and therefore somewhat neither. The Levittown developments that became the template for suburban expansion offered houses of identical or near-identical design at prices that returning veterans supported by GI Bill mortgages could actually afford. These houses came with yards, driveways, and the implicit expectation of a car, because the suburb was not walkable to much of anything. The local shops that had anchored urban neighbourhoods, the bakery, the butcher, the greengrocer, did not exist yet in these new communities, and in many cases they never would, because the suburb was built from the beginning around the assumption that people would drive somewhere larger to do their shopping. That larger place was the supermarket, which in the late 1940s and early 1950s was itself undergoing a rapid expansion in scale. Stores that had previously occupied a few thousand square feet were growing into 10, 20, 30,000 square feet of selling floor, enough room for full produce sections, meat counters, dairy aisles, and all the canned and packaged goods that post-war food manufacturers were producing at industrial scale. The visual experience of entering one of these new stores, if you'd grown up shopping at a corner grocery, must have been genuinely disorienting. The ceiling was high, the aisles were long, the fluorescent lighting was bright and flat and slightly buzzing, and the quantity of things available, more varieties of jam than you had previously known existed, more cuts of meat than you'd ever seen in one place, was both exciting and quietly overwhelming. The station wagon completed the picture. With a refrigerator at home and a large car in the driveway, the weekly shop became logistically viable in a way it hadn't been before. You could buy enough food for 7 days, load it into the back of the car, drive it home, and put it away in the refrigerator and the pantry without any of it spoiling before you got there. The daily trip to the market, which had been necessary when your storage was limited, became not just unnecessary but inefficient, a use of time that the weekly shop eliminated in a single organised outing. American families organised themselves around this rhythm with remarkable speed, and the rhythm, once established, became almost invisible, just the way shopping worked, the way the week was structured, the shape of an ordinary Tuesday when the refrigerator was getting low. Clarence Birdseye was a fur trader in Labrador in the 1910s when he noticed something that would change the American dinner table forever. Fish that froze quickly in the brutal Arctic cold tasted significantly better when thawed than fish that froze slowly. The rapid freeze locked something in: texture, flavour, cellular structure that slow freezing destroyed. He spent the next decade turning that observation into a commercial technology, and by the late 1920s he had developed a system of flash freezing foods that could preserve them for months without sacrificing much of their original quality. The frozen food industry was slow to launch. Freezer cases in stores were expensive, consumers were skeptical, and the vegetables looked alarming. But after the war, when supermarkets began installing proper frozen food sections and families began buying home freezers, everything changed. Suddenly dinner could be something you pulled from a box. It could be peas in January, pot roast without an afternoon of cooking, orange juice without an orange in sight. The convenience was real. The cultural shift was enormous. The The skepticism about frozen food in its early years was not irrational. The freezing technology available to most consumers before Birds Eye's innovations was genuinely bad, slow, inconsistent, and damaging to the cellular structure of most foods in ways that produced an unpleasant mush when thawed. The icebox, which kept things cold but not frozen, had conditioned Americans to expect a fairly short window of freshness from perishable items. The idea that a vegetable picked in summer could be frozen and taste acceptable in February was not immediately credible, and early frozen food products, which were often underseasoned, oddly textured, and packaged without much attention to presentation, did not always make a compelling first impression. What changed the equation was infrastructure. Birds Eye's technology required a cold chain, continuous refrigeration from the point of freezing through the transport truck, the warehouse, the store's freezer case, and the home freezer, and building that chain took time and capital. When General Foods acquired Birds Eye's operation in 1929, they had the resources to invest in the infrastructure, but the Depression and then the war slowed the rollout. By the late 1940s, though, the pieces were in place, and frozen food began its rapid ascent into the American kitchen. The frozen vegetable was probably the most consequential product in this expansion, for a reason that seems unremarkable until you think about it. Before freezing, vegetables were seasonal in a way that was absolute and unavoidable. Peas were available when peas grew. Corn was available when corn grew. In winter, you ate what had been canned or stored, and fresh vegetables of any kind were either very expensive or simply absent. The frozen vegetable broke that constraint entirely. Now you could have green beans in February without paying a premium, without a garden, without any connection to the season in which they had actually grown. This was a genuine nutritional and logistical improvement for millions of families, and it was also the beginning of a slow disconnection from the rhythms of the agricultural year that would only deepen as the food system grew more sophisticated. You stopped knowing what was in season because it no longer mattered. The freezer case had made the question irrelevant. The TV dinner was introduced by Swanson in 1953, and the story behind it is the kind of thing that sounds like it was invented for a marketing pitch. The company had 360 tons of leftover Thanksgiving turkey and nowhere to put it. A salesman named Jerry Thomas reportedly suggested portioning the turkey into sectioned aluminum trays with side dishes, the kind of trays he'd seen used on airplane meals, and selling the whole thing as a complete frozen dinner. Swanson sold 10 million of them in the first year. The name itself was the masterstroke. A TV dinner wasn't just food, it was permission. Permission to eat in the living room, in front of the television, without a set table, without a conversation, without the production of a proper meal. For children, it was thrilling. For home economists and family values, columnists, it was a sign of civilizational decline. For the food industry, it was a blueprint, proof that Americans would buy a complete meal in a box if you made it convenient enough, and that the line between food and product was blurrier than anyone had admitted. The sectioned tray was a design object of peculiar genius. Each compartment was a separate argument for the product. Here is your protein, here is your starch, here is your vegetable, arranged in a way that mimicked the structure of a proper plate without requiring a plate, a cook, or any of the decisions that producing a balanced meal usually involved. The portion sizes were modest by later American standards, and the flavours were calibrated to be familiar and inoffensive rather than interesting. The turkey was turkey, the corn was corn. The mashed potatoes tasted like the idea of mashed potatoes, recognisable, comforting, and completely unchallenging. This was not accidental. Swanson was selling certainty as much as food. You knew exactly what you were getting because you'd had it before, and it would be exactly the same again next time. Eating in front of the television was, in 1953, still a slightly transgressive act in households that had grown up observing the dinner table as a social institution. The family meal, everyone present, conversation expected, manners enforced, had carried genuine cultural weight for generations. The TV dinner didn't kill the family dinner immediately, but it introduced a competing model, one where eating was individual rather than communal, passive rather than conversational, oriented toward entertainment rather than each other. The industry positioned this as convenience. Critics positioned it as the beginning of the end of something. Both were probably right, and neither was going to stop the thing from happening. What the TV dinner really invented was the concept of the meal as a manufactured product, with a consistent specification, something designed in a food laboratory, produced on an assembly line, and delivered to the consumer in a form that required no interpretation and almost no effort. This framework would eventually produce the entire category of packaged, prepared foods that now constitutes a significant percentage of what Americans eat. The frozen lasagna, the microwavable burrito, the steam-in-bag vegetable with sauce already included, all of them are descendants of that aluminum tray with its 3-sectioned compartments and its picture of a golden turkey on the box. Jerry Thomas, if the story's true, solved a turkey surplus and accidentally redesigned American dinner. Not a bad Tuesday's work. Before the 1950s, cereal was health food, or at least it was sold that way. John Harvey Kellogg invented cornflakes in the 1890s as part of a sanitarium diet designed to suppress appetite, improve digestion, and, in his particular vision, discourage thoughts he considered morally dangerous. It was not a fun product. It was not marketed to children. It was sold to adults who wanted to be virtuous before 8 in the morning. And then television happened. Once food companies discovered that Saturday morning cartoons could deliver millions of children directly to their living rooms, children who then turned to their parents with specific, urgent, non-negotiable cereal requests, breakfast was redesigned from scratch. Sugar arrived. Marshmallows arrived. Cartoon mascots arrived. Tony the Tiger, Cap'n Crunch, Count Chocula, each one a small, brightly coloured argument for a product that had roughly the nutritional profile of a dessert. The cereal aisle became one of the most contested spaces in the supermarket, because it was the place where children most visibly had purchasing power, and the industry had figured that out. The Saturday morning cartoon block, which dominated American television from the late 1950s through the 1980s, was one of the most effective advertising delivery mechanisms ever constructed. Children would sit for 3, 4, 5 hours, watching cartoons interrupted every 7 minutes by commercials for products aimed specifically at them, most of which were food. The cereal commercials were the most sophisticated, short, loud, brightly animated, and ruthlessly focused on the sensory appeal of the product. The cereal poured in slow motion. The colours were impossibly vivid. The cartoon mascot ate a bowl and responded with something approaching ecstatic joy. By 9 in the morning on a Saturday, a 6-year-old who had been watching television for 2 hours had essentially received a comprehensive education in which cereals existed and why they were wonderful, delivered in a format designed to bypass the critical faculties that adults use to evaluate advertising claims. What made this particularly effective was that the child was then taken to the grocery store, where the cereal aisle was stocked at child eye level with the exact boxes from the commercials. The loop was perfect. Television created the desire, the supermarket completed the transaction, the parent navigated the gap between them with varying degrees of success and parental patience. The phrase pester power entered the vocabulary of marketing researchers in the 1960s to describe exactly this dynamic, the ability of children to influence household purchasing decisions through sustained, targeted, emotionally escalating request. The cereal companies had discovered it before anyone had named it, and they had built an industry around it. Kellogg's Corn Flakes, meanwhile, did not disappear. They occupy an aisle that is now also home to Fruit Loops, Lucky Charms, Cocoa Puffs, and something called Reese's Puffs that is explicitly dessert by another name. The original product, plain, crunchy, made from corn, devoid of cartoon mascots, is still there on the shelf, slightly dignified in its plainness, surrounded on all sides by its loudly coloured descendants. John Harvey Kellogg, who was by most accounts a deeply strange man, would almost certainly not have approved of any of this. He also would have lost the argument decisively. Sugar won breakfast, and it won it at child eye level in the cereal aisle of every supermarket in America. For most of the 1950s and 60s, the weekly grocery run was understood to be women's work, specifically the work of the suburban housewife who planned the meals, wrote the list, drove to the store, navigated the aisles, selected the produce, managed the budget, loaded the car, unloaded the car, and then cooked the food she had bought before doing it all again the following week. This was not considered labour in any formal sense. It was considered part of keeping house, which was itself not considered a job so much as a condition of being a wife. The supermarket was designed around her habits, her hours, and her preferences in ways that were sometimes thoughtful and sometimes manipulative. Wide aisles for the cart and the children, displays at eye level for adults and lower down for kids, loss leaders at the back of the store to pull her through as many departments as possible. She was the supermarket's most important customer, and the industry studied her with the intensity of a behavioural science experiment, which in many ways it was. The phrase the family grocery budget was almost always, in practice, the housewife's grocery budget, a fixed sum she was given or allocated or had negotiated, which she was expected to stretch across a week of meals for a family without anyone going hungry or noticing that things were tight. Managing this budget was a genuine skill that required arithmetic, planning, knowledge of which stores had better prices on which items, and the ability to substitute creatively when something was too expensive or out of stock. None of this was acknowledged as skill. It was acknowledged as what women did, the same way breathing was what everyone did, and the woman who did it exceptionally well was simply considered a good housewife rather than someone with a measurable economic competency that her household depended on entirely. The supermarket industry understood her importance commercially, even when the broader culture declined to. Market research firms in the 1950s and 60s conducted extensive studies of female shopping behaviour, how long women spent in different aisles, what prompted them to pick up an unfamiliar product, how they responded to end cap displays and promotional signage. These studies were often condescending in their framing. There was a persistent assumption in the research that women made purchasing decisions emotionally rather than rationally, that they were susceptible to packaging and colour in ways that implied irrationality rather than the entirely reasonable response to a designed environment. The conclusions drawn were then used to design stores and products that worked on exactly the psychological mechanisms the researchers had been mildly disparaging about. It was a strange loop. The cost to the women doing this work was real and largely invisible. The weekly shop took a significant chunk of time planning the list, driving to the store, moving through it with children in tow, managing the checkout, loading and unloading the car, and produced no income, no recognition, and no career advancement. It was simply expected, like the cooking that preceded the shopping and the dishes that followed it. When second-wave feminism began to articulate the invisible labour of domestic work in economic terms, the grocery run was one of the clearest examples available, a skilled, time-consuming, economically consequential activity performed millions of times a week by women whose contribution to household welfare was acknowledged mostly in its absence when it didn't get done. The modern supermarket is not arranged by accident. Every decision about whether milk lives, which products sit at eye level, how wide the aisles are, whether the floor curves or runs straight, and what music plays at what tempo has been studied, tested and optimized to influence the behavior of the person pushing the cart. Paco Underhill, a retail anthropologist who spent decades observing shoppers in stores, identified patterns so consistent they might as well be laws. People almost always turn right when they enter a store. They slow down at visual breaks in the aisle. They reach for products at eye level without thinking. They spend more when the music is slower. They buy more when the produce section is at the entrance because fresh vegetables put them in a generous, optimistic frame of mind, and that optimism follows them into the chip aisle. None of this was accidental. American supermarkets evolved over decades into sophisticated environments where the architecture itself was an argument, and the argument was always the same: stay longer, fill the cart, come back next week. The milk is in the back of the store for a reason, and that reason is not logistical. Milk is a purchase that a significant percentage of shoppers come in specifically to buy, and placing it at the back of the store requires a customer to walk past the entire store to get there, and then walk past the entire store again to leave. Every aisle you pass is an opportunity for an unplanned purchase. The baking supplies you didn't know you needed, the snack you'll buy because it's there and you're slightly hungry and the packaging's cheerful, the item that was on sale last time and might be on sale again, so you check. The dairy section is placed with the deliberate intention of making you walk through more store than you came in to see, and it works every time, including on people who know it works and still end up at the register with things they didn't plan to buy. Eye level is buy level. This is an actual phrase used in the grocery industry, not a joke. The products positioned between roughly waist height and just above eye level are there because they are the most profitable, either for the store or for the manufacturer who has paid for that position in what the industry calls slotting fees. The product on the top shelf and the product on the bottom shelf are not there by chance either. They are typically the store brand and the oversized economy format respectively, positioned so that the shopper who reaches for the branded product at eye level has to make a deliberate additional effort to choose something cheaper. The path of least resistance runs straight through the most profitable options. The scent of fresh bread from the in-store bakery, which is rarely placed at the back near the bread aisle but often near the entrance, is not there because that's where the ovens fit. It is there because the smell of fresh bread activates appetite and generates a feeling of warmth and abundance that makes shoppers more generous with the cart. Background music in grocery stores is typically slower than conversational tempo because research consistently shows that slower music slows the shopping pace, increasing time in the store and total spending. None of this is secret exactly. It's been written about extensively, including in books you can buy at the airport, and none of it stops working simply because you know about it. The supermarket is a very well-designed room, and you are in it, and the cart is right there, and the bread smells incredible. The refrigerator changed what Americans ate before the supermarket had time to stock the shelves. In 1920, fewer than 1% of American homes had a mechanical refrigerator. By 1950, nearly 90% did. That shift, compressed into roughly 3 decades, was one of the fastest rewirings of domestic behaviour in modern history, and its effect rippled outward in every direction. Leftovers became possible. Bulk buying became sensible. Meal planning across a whole week became the kind of thing a household could actually manage. Foods that had required daily purchase because they spoiled so quickly, milk, meat, certain vegetables, could now sit safely for days. The icebox had always been a compromise. The refrigerator was a commitment. It didn't just preserve food. It changed the relationship between the kitchen and the store, between the cook and the calendar, between what a family ate and how far in advance they thought about it. The refrigerator made the weekly grocery run logical, and the weekly grocery run made the supermarket necessary. Before mechanical refrigeration, keeping food cold was a seasonal industry built around ice. Companies cut ice from frozen lakes and rivers in winter, packed it in sawdust, stored it in underground ice houses, and delivered it by wagon to households that owned an icebox, a wooden or metal cabinet lined with zinc or tin, insulated as well as the era could manage, and reliant on a block of ice that melted at an inconvenient pace and had to be replaced every few days. The icebox worked in the way that a leaky boat works, well enough to get somewhere, not well enough to fully relax. Meat kept for a day or two. Milk soured quickly regardless. The drip pan underneath had to be emptied before it overflowed, a task so reliably forgotten that it produced a specific domestic conflict recognized across generations. The icebox was a placeholder, and everyone who used one knew it. The mechanical refrigerator arrived with the particular glamour that attaches to appliances that solve a genuinely irritating problem. By the 1930s, manufacturers were competing on aesthetics as much as function. Rounded corners, white enamel finishes, chrome handles, the clean, modern look of something that had been designed rather than just built. The refrigerator became a domestic status symbol in a way the icebox never had, and its appearance in a kitchen announced something about the household that owned it. Modern, organized, forward-thinking, in possession of technology that the previous generation had not had access to. What changed in the kitchen itself was the planning horizon. The cook who had organized her week around daily shopping now had days of lead time. Monday's leftover pot roast could become Wednesday's hash without anyone getting sick. A larger piece of meat could be bought because the excess would keep. Produce purchased at the beginning of the week would still be edible, if not as good, by the end of it. The refrigerator introduced a buffer between the store and the meal, and that buffer changed not just logistics but imagination. You could think about food differently when you weren't required to think about it every single day. The freezer compartment, which began as a small shelf at the top of the refrigerator and gradually expanded into a separate appliance standing beside it, extended these possibilities further still. A household with a chest freezer in the basement, a common feature of American homes by the 1960s, could buy in bulk, stock up during sales, store the summer's garden surplus, and approach the weekly shop not as a necessity but as a routine replenishment. The refrigerator had given Americans time, the freezer gave them room. Together, they rebuilt the American pantry from the inside out, and the supermarket evolved to fill every inch of the space they had created. The word processed only became a pejorative much later. In the 1940s and 50s, processed food was genuinely exciting, a sign that science had arrived in the kitchen to solve problems that housewives had been navigating for generations. Why spend an afternoon making soup from scratch when a can of Campbell's could produce the same result in 10 minutes? Why roast a chicken every week when Spam could provide protein without the prep work, the mess, or the planning? The post-war food industry marketed processed products not as shortcuts but as solutions, rational, modern, efficient answers to the inefficiencies of traditional cooking. Powdered eggs, instant mashed potatoes, condensed soups, packaged cake mixes, each one represented not laziness, but progress. And families bought into it, literally, in enormous quantities. It wasn't until decades later, when the health consequences began to accumulate and the ingredient list grew incomprehensible, that the romance started to fade. But in those early years, opening a can felt like the future arriving in your kitchen right on schedule. The wartime food technology that fed armies turned out to be surprisingly applicable to feeding families. dehydration, canning, fortification, emulsification, techniques developed or refined under the pressure of military logistics were redirected after the war into consumer products that hit grocery shelves with the confidence of things that had already been tested under difficult conditions. If powdered eggs could sustain a soldier in the Pacific, they could certainly manage a Tuesday breakfast in Ohio. The logic was not wrong. The product was not quite right, but the logic was not wrong. Campbell's soup occupied a particular place in the post-war American kitchen that went well beyond the can itself. Andy Warhol would eventually make it famous as art, but before it was art, it was infrastructure. The foundation of 1,000 casseroles, the base of countless sauces, the ingredient that appeared in the cream of mushroom green bean dish that became mandatory at Thanksgiving tables across the country for decades. The condensed soup was efficient in a specific way that home cooks recognized and valued immediately. It was pre-seasoned, pre-proportioned, consistent, and forgiving. You could not really ruin a dish that started with a can of cream of mushroom soup, and in a culture that was simultaneously telling women that cooking was their primary means of expressing love and care, a product that prevented failure was not a shortcut. It was armor. The cake mix requires its own acknowledgement. When Betty Crocker introduced its first complete cake mix in the 1940s, a product that required only water, producing a finished batter in minutes, the company discovered something unexpected. Women didn't want it. The mix that did everything felt like cheating, and cheating felt like not caring, and not caring felt like failing at something the culture had told them was central to their identity as wives and mothers. Betty Crocker's solution was to remove the powdered egg from the formula and require the baker to add a fresh egg herself. This single change, requiring a small act of personal contribution, made the product acceptable. The addition of one egg transformed a manufactured product into something that felt handmade, and sales followed immediately. The processed food industry had learned something that would serve it for decades. Convenience sells better when it leaves room for the consumer to feel like they did something. Before mass manufacturing and national advertising, a can of tomatoes was a can of tomatoes. You bought it from whoever stocked it, and the name on the label was of minor interest. But as the 20th century progressed and American food companies learned to spend heavily on radio, then television, then print advertising, something began to shift in the way families made purchasing decisions. The brand became the product. You didn't buy soup, you bought Campbell's. You didn't buy crackers, you bought Ritz. You didn't buy ketchup, you bought Heinz. This wasn't just familiarity, it was trust, identity, and an implicit promise about consistency. The brand guaranteed that the product you took home this week would taste exactly like the product you took home last month. In a world of abundant choice that was growing more abundant every year, brand loyalty was a cognitive shortcut that felt like a personal preference. Food companies understood this, invested heavily in it, and built dynasties around the premise that the name on the box was worth more than what was inside it. The radio changed American food first. In the 1920s and 30s, national radio networks delivered advertising into living rooms across the country in a way that had never previously been possible. A single campaign could reach millions of households simultaneously, and a brand could establish a national presence without a single salesperson setting foot in most of the cities where its products were now being recognized and requested. Jell-O sponsored Jack Benny. Gold Medal Flour sponsored cooking programs. Crisco ran recipes in newspapers that treated their product as the self-evident choice for any serious home cook. The brand was being woven into the texture of domestic life so gradually and so continuously that it became indistinguishable from preference. Television accelerated everything. The 1950s housewife who watched daytime television encountered her grocery brands in the same domestic setting where she would later use them, the advertisement and the product existing in the same room, connected by repetition and familiarity. A generation of Americans grew up knowing that Coke was it, that Wheaties built champions, that nothing said lovin' like something from the oven in the specific Pillsbury sense. These were not just slogans, they were cultural furniture, so thoroughly installed in the household imagination that choosing a different brand felt slightly disloyal, the way switching sports teams feels to people who take sports seriously. The store brand existed throughout this period as the alternative you took when money was tight, and the stigma attached to it was real and deliberate. National brands spent significant resources cultivating the impression that their product was superior to any generic equivalent, which was sometimes true in terms of consistency, and sometimes not true at all in terms of taste or nutrition, but was very consistently true in terms of packaging, advertising, and cultural positioning. The woman who bought the store brand of cereal instead of the familiar box was making a statement she might not have wanted to make, about her budget, her priorities, or her family's standing. Brand loyalty was cheaper than it looked, when you accounted for what it cost to refuse it. The American supermarket has always been a map of who arrived, who assimilated, and how quickly the mainstream decided a foreign food was safe for everyone. For much of the mid-20th century, the grocery store reflected a fairly narrow vision of American eating, one built largely around Northern European tastes, with some regional variation. Italian food was an early crossover, partly because Italian immigration was so large and so early that pasta and tomato sauce had naturalized by the post-war era. But other cuisines arrived more slowly, often appearing first in small specialty shops serving immigrant communities before being adapted, softened, and relocated to a dedicated ethnic aisle in the mainstream supermarket, sometimes labelled with a flag, sometimes labelled with a cuisine, always positioned as the exotic option rather than the standard one. The ethnic aisle was both an acknowledgement and a boundary. We sell this, but it's still not the default. What those boundaries were, and when they shifted, tracks fairly closely with which communities gained cultural power and which were still considered guests at the American table. The Chinese restaurant preceded the Chinese grocery aisle by several decades in most American cities, which is its own kind of commentary. Americans were willing to eat Chinese food before they were willing to stock the ingredients to make it at home, a distinction that says something about the difference between consuming a culture's food as an experience and integrating it into the daily domestic routine. The restaurant offered the flavour without the strangeness of unfamiliar packaging in the pantry, without the need to understand what an ingredient was or how to use it, without the small act of commitment that buying a bottle of soy sauce for the first time represents. The grocery store demanded a little more, a willingness to incorporate something foreign into the ordinary week, and that threshold was crossed at different times for different ingredients and different communities. Soy sauce crossed it remarkably quietly. By the 1970s and 80s, it had migrated from Asian grocery stores to the international aisle of mainstream supermarkets, and from there, gradually, to the general condiment section where it now sits beside Worcestershire sauce, without anyone finding that remarkable. The same journey took different amounts of time for different ingredients: tahini, fish sauce, miso, gochujang, each following a path from specialty shop to ethnic aisle to mainstream shelf on a timeline shaped by immigration patterns, culinary curiosity, and the pace at which the American palate was willing to expand. What got left out of that journey, and what still gets left out, is worth noticing. The ethnic aisle in a mainstream American supermarket has historically reflected the cuisines of communities with sufficient economic and demographic weight to move product at scale, which means it has systematically underrepresented certain communities regardless of the quality or complexity of their food traditions. The selection available to a recent immigrant from a small country in a medium-sized American city is almost never adequate for home cooking in the way they learned it, and the nearest substitute is often a specialty store an hour away. The grocery store offers a version of multiculturalism that is real in its breadth and limited in its depth, curated by purchasing decisions and demographic analysis, rather than by any principled attempt to honour the full range of what people actually eat. Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique in 1963, and among its many observations about the quiet desperation of suburban women was the idea that the domestic sphere had been simultaneously glorified and diminished, told it was sacred, treated as invisible. The food industry walked a strange line through all of this. On one hand, convenience products genuinely reduced the physical labour of cooking. Frozen vegetables meant no peeling, no blanching, no standing over a pot. Cake mixes meant a birthday cake without a full afternoon's work. Instant coffee meant a cup in 2 minutes, instead of 20. These were real reductions in time and effort for women who were doing the bulk of domestic labour without acknowledgement or pay. On the other hand, the marketing of those same products often doubled down on the notion that cooking was primarily a woman's domain, her creative outlet, her expression of love, her central purpose. The supermarket made dinner easier and then told women they should still want to make it from scratch. It was a very specific kind of contradiction, and millions of families lived inside it every week. The women's magazines of the 1950s and 60s navigated this contradiction with spectacular agility. On one page, a feature on the liberation that frozen dinners offered the modern woman. On the facing page, a recipe for a from-scratch pot roast that would demonstrate her care and creativity to a husband who deserved a real meal. The advertising that ran through both features sold products for both purposes, the convenient shortcut and the ambitious production, and the implicit message was that the truly accomplished housewife could do both, effortlessly, while also looking good and maintaining a spotless kitchen. This was not a reasonable expectation. It was, however, an extremely effective marketing framework. The frozen vegetable removed about 45 minutes from a Tuesday night. That is not nothing. Shelling peas, stringing beans, peeling and chopping anything. These tasks were time-consuming in a way that is easy to underestimate if you've never had to do them daily for a family. The woman who spent that 45 minutes on something else, reading, resting, helping with homework, pursuing any of the interests that the culture simultaneously encouraged her to have and provided no time for, was making a rational exchange. The convenience food industry occasionally acknowledged this in advertising that spoke directly to the idea of time reclaimed. More often, it sold the same products by emphasizing how much the family would enjoy the result, centering the woman's role as nurturer rather than her experience as a person with finite hours in a day. The frozen dinner, the cake mix, the condensed soup, these products did reduce labor. They did not redistribute it. The time saved in the kitchen did not produce any renegotiation of who was responsible for the kitchen. It produced a slightly less exhausted woman who was still entirely responsible for the kitchen, now with enough energy left over to feel guilty that she wasn't doing more of it from scratch. The supermarket gave women tools that made domestic labour easier, without questioning whether domestic labour was a reasonable division of responsibility in the first place. Because questioning that was not something the supermarket industry was positioned to do, and also because the answer would have been bad for sales. Before the internet, before the smartphone, and before the particular isolation of modern life had fully calcified, the grocery store was where you ran into people. Not on purpose, not by appointment, just the ordinary collision of neighbours in the same aisle on the same Tuesday afternoon. For suburban women in the 1950s and 60s, many of whom spent most of their weekday hours in or near the house, the weekly shopping trip was one of the primary social events of the week. You talked to the produce manager who knew your name. You ran into your neighbour by the dairy case and learned something about her that you wouldn't have otherwise. You watched other women's carts and drew quiet conclusions. The supermarket was a public space that felt semi-private, a place where social life happened informally and continuously. This dimension of the grocery store is almost entirely invisible now. It is not the thing food historians typically discuss, and yet it was real. And its slow erosion as stores grew larger and more anonymous was a genuine loss for certain kinds of community connection. The checkout line was its own institution. It was one of the few spaces in suburban life where strangers were in genuinely close proximity, facing the same direction, with nothing particular to do for several minutes, which is a social configuration that almost automatically produces conversation. The contents of the cart ahead of you were visible and informative. You knew whether your neighbour was feeding children or cooking for two, whether she was having company this weekend, whether her family ate differently from yours in ways that were interesting or slightly strange. This information passed without anyone intending to share it, and the conversation that sometimes arose from it was the kind that suburban life didn't otherwise produce very often, accidental, momentary, and occasionally the beginning of an actual friendship. The produce manager and the butcher counter still carried some of the relational weight that their predecessors in the corner store and the neighbourhood market had carried for generations. A butcher who knew you would set aside a cut he knew you liked, tell you what was freshest, suggest something different when nothing good had come in. This was not just commercial transaction. It was a small form of being known, of having your habits and preferences remembered by someone outside your immediate family. As supermarkets grew larger and staffing models shifted towards self-service and away from staffed counters, this dimension of the shopping experience contracted. The store got bigger. The number of employees per square foot went down. The people who worked there turned over more frequently. The chance that the man behind the meat counter knew your name approached zero and eventually arrived there. What replaced the community function of the grocery store was, for a while, nothing. A gap in the social infrastructure of suburban life that nobody formally acknowledged because it had never been formally acknowledged in the first place. The grocery run had been social without ever being recognised as social, which meant its erosion went unmourned and mostly unnoticed. The way you don't notice a window has been bricked over until you're trying to remember what used to let the light in. The store got more efficient, the prices got better, the selection expanded enormously, and the thing that had been happening between the people in the aisles simply stopped happening, quietly, over the course of a few decades. For most of human history, snacking was not a category. You ate meals. Between meals you were hungry, and hunger was the signal that the next meal was approaching. The idea of a dedicated food product industry built entirely around satisfying hunger between meals, not hunger from exertion, not the hunger of children who couldn't wait, but ordinary between-meal desire reframed as a normal and even sophisticated need, is a genuinely recent invention. The American snack food industry began to take its modern shape after World War II, when the same technologies that had produced processed food for soldiers were redirected toward peacetime consumption. Potato chips, pretzels, popcorn, crackers, corn chips, each one a shelf-stable, highly palatable product that could be packaged, branded, and sold in the impulse buy zones near checkout counters. Frito-Lay alone would grow into a billion-dollar company by the 1960s. What the snack food industry really sold was permission. Permission to eat something that was not a meal, not a necessity, not tied to a time of day. And once Americans had that permission, they used it constantly. The potato chip is a useful place to start because it contains, in miniature, almost everything the snack food industry would become. It is thin, light, and salty, calibrated to a flavour profile that the human palate responds to with an enthusiasm that is not fully under conscious control. It is impossible to eat exactly one, which the industry eventually acknowledged in advertising, with a frankness that was either admirable or alarming depending on your perspective. It produces no satiety proportional to the calories it delivers, so the signal to stop eating arrives later than the bag does. And it is shelf-stable for months, which means it can be produced at scale, distributed widely, and sold from virtually any retail location without spoiling. The potato chip was not engineered to have these properties initially. It was a happy accident of frying technology and flavour chemistry. But once the properties were identified, the industry designed around them with considerable sophistication. The snack food aisle expanded continuously through the post-war decades, tracking the growth of television, the suburbanization of American life, and the slow normalization of eating outside of meal times. Television was the key enabler. Sitting in front of a screen for 2 hours in the evening created a context where the hands had nothing to do and the mouth was idle, and the food industry stepped into that gap with products specifically designed for the passive consumption setting, things that could be eaten without utensils, without plates, without interrupting the act of watching. The bowl of chips on the coffee table during a television program is such a settled feature of American domestic life that it feels timeless, but it was invented within living memory by an industry that needed somewhere to go with the production capacity it had built up supplying the military. PepsiCo's acquisition of Frito-Lay in 1965 created a company that understood something the separate businesses had only intuited. Salty snacks and sugary drinks were symbiotic products, each increasing desire for the other, and selling them together under one corporate umbrella was an arrangement of considerable efficiency. The combination of a chip and a cold soda is not an accident of taste. It is a feedback loop that the industry identified, optimized, and has been deploying in supermarket aisles, vending machines, and convenience stores ever since. The snack food industry did not create human appetite. It studied it with scientific seriousness, and then built a delivery system designed to work with the appetite's mechanics rather than against them, and then sold the results in every checkout lane in America. The school lunchbox was a microcosm of everything the post-war food industry had built. By the 1950s, the ideal packed lunch was not a homemade meal in a cloth sack, but a curated collection of branded products, a sandwich on white bread from a commercial bakery, a small bag of chips, a piece of fruit that had probably come from several states away, and something sweet wrapped in wax paper that came from a box with a cartoon on it. The lunchbox itself was a status object, often featuring the face of a television character, and what went inside it was subject to the same social dynamics that governed what adults ate in public. Children compared lunches. Certain products signalled familiarity with the right brands, the right flavours, the right cultural fluency. Parents who packed anything too unusual, anything that smelled too strongly, looked too foreign, or required explanation, ran the risk of social difficulty for their children, and most parents knew it. The lunchbox was where the grocery store's influence on family eating became visible to children for the first time. The lunchbox itself deserves a moment of attention as an object, because its design was part of the product ecosystem. In the 1950s, the metal lunchbox with a matching thermos became a childhood institution, and the licensing arrangements that put television characters on those boxes, Hop-Along Cassidy in 1950, The Lone Ranger shortly after, and eventually every cartoon and television program that had an audience of children, were early and highly effective merchandise operations. A child carrying a Roy Rogers lunchbox to school was not just carrying lunch. He was carrying a statement about his television consumption, his cultural affiliations, and the purchasing decisions of his parents. The lunchbox was branded before the food inside it was. The food inside caught up quickly. This sandwich was the structural centre of the packed lunch for decades, and the type of sandwich available to any given child was determined almost entirely by what the grocery store in their neighbourhood stocked and what their parents could afford. White bread with peanut butter and jelly was the democratic option. Cheap, non-perishable until opened, acceptable to the widest possible range of children, and carrying no social risk whatsoever. It was also, not coincidentally, a product composed almost entirely of branded packaged goods, Wonder Bread, Jif, Smuckers, all shelf-stable, all inexpensive, all supported by significant advertising budgets. The peanut butter and jelly sandwich was not just a lunch. It was the result of 3 separate marketing campaigns, working in coordination without ever having coordinated. The school cafeteria existed in parallel with the packed lunch as an alternative that carried its own social coding. Federal school lunch programs, which expanded significantly after World War II in response to evidence that military recruits had been found malnourished in alarming numbers, offered hot meals at low cost to children whose families couldn't provide an adequate packed lunch. The cafeteria, lunch was stigmatized in many schools in ways that were nakedly about class. A free lunch was a visible signal of financial need, and the social dynamics around that visibility were uncomfortable enough that many families stretched their budgets to avoid it. The grocery store, by providing the materials for a packed lunch however modest, allowed parents to participate in the performance of adequate provision for their children, regardless of whether the lunch itself was better than what the cafeteria offered. By the early 1960s, the American grocery store was doing 2 things simultaneously that did not obviously go together: selling more food than anyone had ever sold before, and beginning to sell products designed to help people eat less of it. The diet industry and the food industry are often presented as opposing forces, but they are more accurately understood as partners in a single economic system, one that profits from abundance and from the anxiety abundance creates. Weight Watchers was founded in 1963. Diet soda arrived in the late 1950s. Low-calorie TV dinners appeared not long after. The language of nutrition, calories, carbohydrates, fat content, protein began migrating from medical contexts onto packaging, making the grocery store aisle a place where you could feel judged by the label before you'd even made a decision. What changed was not just what people ate, but how they felt about eating it. The grocery store, which had once sold food, now also sold guilt, reassurance, and the promise that the right product could fix the problem created by all the other products. Tab, introduced by Coca-Cola in 1963, was the first widely marketed diet soda in America, and its initial advertising was directed almost exclusively at women, specifically at women who wanted to maintain their figures while continuing to participate in the social ritual of drinking a soft drink. The can was slender. The advertising showed women who were also slender. The product contained saccharin, which had a slightly strange aftertaste that everyone acknowledged, and nobody found disqualifying because the alternative, consuming sugar, and the calories it represented, was framed as a worse compromise. Tab was not really a beverage. It was a negotiation, a daily transaction between desire and discipline that the grocery store was now facilitating at scale. The diet product category expanded through the 60s and 70s with a velocity that tracked almost exactly with the expansion of the broader food industry. Every category that produced a standard version produced a reduced calorie version alongside it. Diet bread, diet margarine, low-fat dairy, sugar-free jam. The underlying logic was consistent. The product you want is available, but there is also a version of it that allows you to want it without consequence, or with reduced consequence, or with the feeling of reduced consequence, which turned out to be commercially equivalent. The distinction between a food that was actually lower in calories and a food that felt virtuous to purchase was not always carefully maintained, and the marketing language around diet products was optimistic in ways that nutritional science sometimes struggled to support. What the diet industry introduced into the grocery store was a moral dimension that had not previously been explicit. Food had always carried social meaning, what you could afford, what your culture ate, what the season provided, but the diet product aisle added a new layer in which certain foods were coded as good choices and others as failures of will. This coding was not neutral. It fell disproportionately on women, for whom body weight was already a more publicly managed and more socially consequential attribute than it was for men. The woman in the diet food aisle was not simply making a nutritional calculation. She was navigating a set of expectations about what her body should look like and what kind of person she was for caring, or not caring enough, about the gap between that ideal and her reality. The grocery store had always been a practical place. Now it was also a slightly judgmental one. No Food tells the story of 20th century American eating quite like white bread. In the early 1900s, white flour was already associated with prosperity and refinement. Darker flours were coarser, cheaper, and associated with the working class and immigrant communities who couldn't afford better. When commercial bakeries developed the technology to produce soft, uniform, pre-sliced white bread at scale, the product became a symbol of modernity itself. Wonder Bread launched in 1921 and was marketing enriched white bread, fortified with vitamins because the milling process had stripped most of them out, as a health product by the 1940s. Mothers were told it built strong bodies. Children ate it by default. By mid-century, white sandwich bread was so thoroughly embedded in the American diet that proposing an alternative would have seemed eccentric, and then slowly it didn't. The bread aisle became one of the most contested spaces in the late 20th century grocery store as whole wheat, multigrain, sourdough, and eventually gluten-free options crowded in, and white bread's long reign as the unquestioned default began quietly to end. The sliced bread innovation of 1928, introduced by the Chillico the Baking Company in Missouri using a machine invented by Otto Rohwedder, who had spent 16 years perfecting it and was largely ignored by the industry until he wasn't, is remembered now primarily as a benchmark for subsequent innovations, as in the best thing since. The phrase became so embedded in the language that most people who use it have no clear idea what the bread in question actually was. It was white sandwich bread, pre-sliced to a uniform thickness, wrapped in wax paper to stay soft, and sold in a form that required no knife, no cutting board, and no skill whatsoever to prepare. It was convenience built into the product at the most fundamental level. The product delivered itself ready to use, and the ease of this was experienced as a minor daily luxury that quickly became invisible, the way all genuine conveniences eventually do. Wonder Bread's marketing during the 1940s and 50s achieved something remarkable. It convinced American parents that an industrial food product with a nutritional profile that had been artificially reconstructed after being largely destroyed by processing was actually good for children. The enrichment of white bread, the addition of synthetic vitamins to replace the ones removed when the bran and germ were stripped from the wheat, was presented not as a correction of a deficiency, but as a positive achievement, evidence that science had improved on what nature had provided. Build strong bodies 8 ways, then 12 ways. The number went up as new vitamins were added to the formula. The bread was a delivery mechanism for nutrients that whole wheat flour had simply contained to begin with, but the packaging made it sound like an advance. The decline of white bread's dominance was slow and then fast, driven by converging forces, the health food movement of the 1970s, the growing body of nutritional research on fibre and whole grains, the arrival of artisan baking culture in the 1980s and 90s, and eventually the gluten-free movement of the 2000s. which disrupted the bread aisle so thoroughly that it now contains products made from rice flour, almond flour, cassava, chickpeas, and various combinations of seeds that would have been unrecognizable in a 1950 supermarket. Wonder Bread still exists. You can still buy it. It occupies a considerably smaller share of the bread aisle than it once did, and it sits there with the quiet dignity of something that was once enormously important and is now mostly nostalgic, the soft, white, slightly sweet taste of a mid-century America that believed science would keep improving the basics until they were perfect. The post-war supermarket boom was not evenly distributed. As supermarket chains followed the suburban migration out of American cities during the 1950s and 60s, the communities left behind, which were disproportionately Black, Latino and low income, were left with smaller, more expensive and less well-stocked grocery stores. The large supermarket chains that offered lower prices through scale and competition were concentrated in suburban areas where their target customers lived, drove and shopped. In urban neighbourhoods that had been redlined, disinvested and systematically denied the capital that might have supported better retail infrastructure, access to fresh, affordable food was genuinely limited. The term food desert would not enter common usage until the 1990s, but the store conditions it describes were already taking shape decades earlier, as the geography of the American supermarket mapped almost perfectly onto the geography of American inequality. What you could eat, and what it cost you, depended heavily on where you were allowed to live. Redlining, the systematic denial of mortgage loans, insurance, and investment to residents of neighbourhoods designated as high risk, designations that tracked almost perfectly with the racial composition of those neighbourhoods, did not just shape where black families could buy homes, it shaped what stores opened near those homes, what quality of produce those stores stocked, and what prices they charged for it. A neighbourhood without capital investment doesn't attract grocery chains that require capital investment. A neighbourhood without car ownership and highway access doesn't attract the large suburban format supermarket that was designed around both. The corner store and the small neighbourhood market that remained in these communities after the chains departed operated at lower volume, higher cost, and with supply chains that couldn't deliver the same freshness or variety. The families shopping there paid more for less, not because they made worse decisions, but because the infrastructure around them had been deliberately constructed to offer them fewer options. The civil rights movement engaged with food access in ways that are less commonly remembered than its more visible battles, but were no less important to the daily lives of the people involved. The grocers and lunch counter owners of the segregated South were economic actors as well as social ones. A black family's grocery dollar went into a system that excluded them from service, employment and ownership in nearly every other dimension. The boycott as a tool of the civil rights movement was partly a grocery boycott, a withdrawal of purchasing power from businesses that depended on black customers, while simultaneously discriminating against them. Montgomery, Birmingham, and dozens of other cities saw organised campaigns to redirect black consumer spending toward businesses that treated black customers with basic dignity, a redirection that was both a protest and an early form of what would later be called conscious consumerism. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 was supposed to begin dismantling the residential segregation that had produced these food access disparities, but the supermarket geography it had created did not reverse with any speed. Chains that had built their distribution networks around suburban stores did not immediately find it profitable to build in urban neighbourhoods, and the decades of disinvestment had created physical and economic conditions that made new development genuinely difficult. The food desert was not a temporary condition produced by the chaos of urban transition. It was a stable feature of the American urban landscape that persisted for generations and required specific, targeted intervention to address rather than simply the passage of time. The grocery store, which in the suburbs had become synonymous with abundance and choice, remained in many American neighborhoods a daily reminder of who the post-war prosperity had been built for. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, a growing counterculture was pushing back against virtually every aspect of mainstream American life, and the grocery store was not exempt. The same generation that questioned the war, the government, and the values of their parents also started questioning what was in the food. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, had already raised alarming questions about pesticides and their effects on ecosystems and human health. The counterculture took those questions and ran with them, literally in some cases toward communal farms, co-ops, and the first natural food stores, which sold whole grains, raw honey, herbal teas, and produced grown without synthetic chemicals to customers who were willing to pay more and drive further to get it. These early natural food stores were small, slightly chaotic, and smelled powerfully of nutritional yeast. They were also the seed of an industry that would eventually grow large enough to be acquired by Amazon. The organic movement began as a fringe concern. Its trajectory was not. The food co-op was the organizational expression of the counterculture's relationship with grocery shopping, a collectively owned, collectively managed alternative to the corporate supermarket that put members in control of what was stocked, where it came from, and how the surplus was distributed. Co-ops required participation in exchange for membership. You worked a shift, attended a meeting, swept a floor. This was understood not as a burden but as a political act, the replacement of passive consumption with active stewardship, the reinsertion of human relationship into a transaction that the supermarket had made entirely anonymous. The food co-op was idealistic, sometimes inefficient, and often located in a building with unreliable heating and a bulk bin section that was either a revelation or a source of mild anxiety depending on your relationship with unlabeled grains. J.I. Rodal, who had been publishing organic farming and gardening magazines since the 1940s, provided the intellectual framework that the counterculture adapted into a lifestyle. Rodal's argument that industrial agriculture's reliance on synthetic fertilizers and pesticides was damaging the soil, the food supply and human health was considered eccentric by mainstream agricultural science for most of the post-war period. By the early 1970s, with pesticide contamination increasingly documented and the limits of the Green Revolution beginning to become visible, it was starting to look less eccentric and more prescient. His son Robert took the Rodale publications mainstream in the 1970s with Prevention magazine, which brought natural health and organic food ideas to a suburban audience that had never set foot in a co-op and had no intention of grinding their own flour. What the organic movement did to the grocery store over the course of several decades was introduce a parallel value system into the purchasing decision, one that evaluated food not just on price, taste, and convenience, but on how it was produced, what it contained, and what its production meant for the land and the people who worked it. This value system was initially confined to a small self-selected community of buyers. Its gradual expansion into the mainstream transformed the grocery store aisle from a purely commercial space into something closer to a values referendum, a place where the choice between two apparently similar products could carry a freight of ethical significance that neither product had carried in 1955. The hippies who started buying bulk oats from the co-op in 1971 did not know they were laying the groundwork for a certified organic section at Target. But here we are. Somewhere in the history of the American supermarket, someone made a decision that would change the nature of waiting in line forever. They filled the checkout counter with things to read. Magazines appeared first, then tabloids, and not just any tabloids, but tabloids specifically designed for the captive audience of someone who had nowhere to go and 2 minutes to kill. The National Enquirer, founded in 1926 and redesigned for supermarket checkout racks in the 1960s, was a publishing masterstroke. It offered exactly what the grocery store customer standing in line needed. Stories short enough to read in a minute, sensational enough to remember, and just credible enough to repeat. By the 1970s, the checkout lane was a complete media environment. Celebrity gossip, weight loss promises, candy bars and gum, all compressed into a final corridor of temptation between the cart and the parking lot. Grocery stores had discovered that the last 12 feet of the shopping experience were as profitable as the first aisle, and they designed them accordingly. The National Enquirer's transformation into a supermarket publication was the work of Generoso Pope Jr., who bought the struggling tabloid in 1952 and spent the next decade building it into the most widely read newspaper in America. Pope understood the checkout line as a media channel before the concept of media channels existed in its current form. The reader in line was not a reader who had chosen to read. She was a reader who had nothing else to do, who was surrounded by visual stimulation on all sides, and whose attention was available to whoever captured it first. Pope captured it with headlines calibrated to the specific emotional register of the checkout line. Alarming but not devastating, salacious but not quite graphic, impossible to fully dismiss even if you suspected they were exaggerated, which they were, consistently and without apology. The candy bar's presence at checkout was older than the tabloid and operated on a different but related principle. By the time you reached the checkout counter after navigating the entire store, you had made dozens of small decisions, exercised varying degrees of willpower around products you wanted but didn't buy, and were in a mild state of decision fatigue, a real psychological condition in which the quality of decisions degrades after sustained decision-making. The candy bar at eye level at the end of this process was not fighting a fresh, alert consumer. It was presenting itself to someone whose resistance was genuinely lower than it had been at the entrance. The checkout lane was not just a place to pay, it was the final sales floor, designed for a customer in a specific and predictable psychological state. The women's magazines that shared the checkout rack with the tabloids performed a function that was almost self-parodic in its consistency. The cover simultaneously featured a recipe for something indulgent and a headline about losing weight quickly, often side by side, sometimes sharing a layout element. This was not confusion or contradiction on the part of the editors. It was an accurate map of the reading customer's mental state. She wanted the recipe, and she wanted the weight loss tip, and she held both desires simultaneously without finding them incompatible, because the grocery store had spent decades teaching her to. The checkout counter was, in this sense, the most concentrated expression of everything the supermarket had become, a place that sold you abundance, and the anxiety of abundance, temptation, and the tools to resist it, in the same 12-foot corridor, on the same rotating rack. Whole Foods Market opened its first store in Austin, Texas in 1980, and at the time it was indistinguishable from the natural food co-ops that already existed in college towns across America, a larger, better-lit version of the same idealistic project, selling organic produce and bulk grains to the same health-conscious customers. But the company grew, went public, expanded aggressively, and by the late 1990s was doing something no natural food store had managed before, making organic groceries feel aspirational rather than austere. The stores were beautiful. The produce was impeccable. The prepared food section was often better than the restaurants nearby, and the prices, which became the subject of an affectionate national joke, the whole paycheck nickname, signaled that eating well was a premium experience available to people who had the money and the values to participate in it. What Whole Foods really sold was a self-image, the shopper as someone who cared, who read labels, who chose differently. That combination of aspiration, ethics, and aesthetics turned out to be extraordinarily powerful, and every mainstream grocery chain spent the next 2 decades chasing it. The original Whole Foods in Austin occupied a former nightclub, 14,000 square feet at the corner of Lamar and 10th Street, and its founders, John Mackey and Renee Lawson Hardy among others, were young enough and idealistic enough to believe that a grocery store could be both profitable and principled, which was not the conventional wisdom in the grocery industry at the time. The conventional wisdom was that natural foods were a niche market. Price-sensitive customers would not pay premiums for organic produce, and the co-op model was charming, but not scalable. Whole Foods proved each of these assumptions wrong, not by arguing against them, but by opening stores that made the alternative feel irresistible. The produce section was the centerpiece of the Whole Foods model, in a way it was not at conventional supermarkets. Standard grocery stores treated produce as a functional category. You needed fruits and vegetables. Here they were, organized by type, reasonably fresh, competitively priced. Whole Foods treated produce as theatre. The displays were abundant and carefully arranged. The lighting was warm, the signage told you where the apple came from and whether the farm was certified organic, and sometimes what the farmer's name was. Shopping for vegetables at Whole Foods felt, and this is the key word, felt like an act of virtue, of connection to something real and right, in a way that shopping for vegetables at a conventional supermarket simply did not. The customer paid a premium not just for the produce but for that feeling, and they paid it voluntarily and repeatedly. Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods in 2017 for $13.7 billion was the moment the organic food movement's trajectory became fully legible. A company that started as an idealistic natural food store in a repurposed nightclub had become valuable enough to attract the interest of one of the largest corporations on earth, which saw in its customer base and its supply chain infrastructure something worth more than $13 billion. Whether this represented the triumph of the organic movement, its values now embedded in a global distribution system, or its absorption and neutralization by exactly the kind of corporate scale it had originally defined itself against, was a question that the original Austin customers, had they been asked, would probably have answered differently from the investors who celebrated the deal. The American grocery store of 1950 stocked roughly 3,000 individual products. By the early 2000s, the average supermarket carried close to 50,000. Much of that expansion was not new flavors of the same things, but genuinely new things, foods from cuisines and cultures that had either not been available in mainstream American stores or had only existed in specialty shops serving immigrant communities. Salsa surpassed ketchup as America's best-selling condiment in the early 1990s, a fact that surprised people who hadn't been paying attention to demographic change. Hummus, once entirely unfamiliar to most American consumers, became a $2 billion category. Sriracha, a Thai-American hot sauce produced in a factory in California, became a condiment with a fan base. Miso, kimchi, harissa, tahini, coconut aminos, each one a capsule of a specific culinary tradition, repackaged, relabeled, and placed on a shelf where someone buying pasta could encounter it without having planned to. The globalization of the grocery store happened gradually, then suddenly, and it changed not just what Americans ate, but how adventurous they expected the store to be. The salsa surpassing ketchup statistic requires a small note of clarification that its enthusiastic repeaters sometimes omit. The comparison was by dollar sales, not volume, and salsa tends to be priced higher per unit than ketchup, which means the comparison was as much about price as about popularity. But the underlying shift it pointed to was real and significant. The Latino population of the United States had grown dramatically through the 1970s and 80s, driven by immigration from Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, and by the early 90s it represented a consumer base large enough that mainstream grocery chains could no longer afford to serve it as an afterthought. Products that had existed only in Latin grocery stores began appearing on mainstream shelves, first in regions with large Latino populations and then nationally, because flavor doesn't respect demographic boundaries, and the non-Latino customers who encountered salsa, chilies, and fresh tortillas in their local supermarket frequently became enthusiastic repeat purchasers. David Tran, the Vietnamese-American founder of Huy Fong Foods, produced the first bottle of sriracha in Los Angeles in 1980, using a recipe he had brought from Vietnam. For years, the sauce was sold primarily in Asian grocery stores and restaurants, known to a specific community of diners and cooks, and largely invisible to the mainstream. Its crossover into general American consciousness happened not through advertising. Huy Fong famously does not advertise, but through restaurant use, food media coverage, and the particular enthusiasm of food writers who had encountered it at Vietnamese and Thai restaurants and wanted to keep using it at home. By the mid-2000s, sriracha had acquired a cultural presence so outsized relative to its marketing budget that it appeared on merchandise, in memes, and on the menus of fast food chains that had no historical relationship with Southeast Asian cuisine whatsoever. The grocery store aisle eventually caught up with the cultural moment, and the Rooster bottle became a standard pantry item in households that would have been unable to identify Vietnam on a map in 1980. The 50,000 product supermarket is in some respects an extraordinary achievement. A single building containing the culinary traditions of dozens of cultures, available simultaneously to anyone who can reach it. It is also, in ways worth acknowledging, a reduction. The specialness of specialty ingredients, the knowledge required to use them well, the cultural context that made them meaningful, all partially dissolved in the process of placing them on a shelf between the soy sauce and the fish sauce under a label that says International Foods. The grocery coupon has existed in some form since the 1880s, when Coca-Cola distributed handwritten tickets for a free glass of the drink to introduce it to new customers. But the coupon as a centerpiece of household budget management became a genuinely mid-century phenomenon, peaking in the 1970s and 80s, when Sunday newspaper inserts arrived thick with savings and families like yours, or at least families in certain television commercials, sat at the kitchen table with scissors and a filing system, clipping and organizing their way toward a smarter, thriftier weekly shop. The coupon economy created a particular kind of shopper who measured the success of a grocery run not by what they'd bought, but by how much they'd saved. A framing the industry encouraged because it focused attention on the discount rather than the price. You hadn't spent $40, you'd saved $7. The grocery store and the coupon were in a long, complicated relationship built on the premise that the customer who felt like they were winning would keep coming back. And mostly they did. The Sunday paper in a coupon-active household was not a newspaper so much as a financial instrument. The freestanding insert, the glossy multi-page collection of manufacturer coupons that arrived folded inside the newspaper and scattered across the kitchen table when opened with insufficient care, was produced by a small number of companies and distributed nationally in quantities that rivaled the circulation of the newspapers that carried them. Velasas and News America. Marketing controlled most of this market, printing billions of coupons annually that travelled from printing plant to newspaper, to kitchen table to grocery store register, in a circuit that connected the largest food manufacturers in the country to the most careful shoppers in the most direct way the industry had yet devised. The coupon was a conversation between a corporation and a consumer conducted through a small rectangle of newsprint, and it worked because both parties found the arrangement useful. The extreme couponer, a figure who emerged as a minor celebrity in the era of reality television and became an object of genuine fascination in the early 2000s, represented the logical endpoint of a practice that the industry had always officially encouraged, while privately hoping would remain within certain limits. A shopper who spent 20 hours a week organising coupons, stacking manufacturer discounts against store sales, timing purchases to coincide with double coupon events, and departing the store with $400 of groceries for $11 was not a customer the grocery store found profitable. She was, however, a useful advertisement for the idea that the grocery store was a place where you could win, and the industry tolerated her presence on television because the average viewer watching her triumph felt inspired rather than equipped. Most people watching an extreme couponing show did not subsequently spend 20 hours a week on coupons. They clipped 2 or 3, felt virtuous about it, and bought the items they were going to buy anyway at a modest discount. The digital coupon, which arrived with the smartphone and the grocery store loyalty app, changed the mechanics without changing the psychology. Instead of scissors and an accordion folder, the modern version involves clicking a button in an app to load a discount onto your loyalty card, which is applied automatically at checkout without the social performance of handing over a physical coupon. It is more convenient, slightly less satisfying, and considerably more useful to the grocery store as a data collection instrument, since every digital coupon you activate tells the store's analytics system something specific about your preferences, your price sensitivity, and your purchasing behavior that the old paper coupon could never have. Communicated. You're still winning. The store is now winning considerably harder. When Walmart opened its first supercenter in 1988, a format combining a full grocery store with its existing general merchandise operation under one enormous roof, the grocery industry did not immediately panic. The stores were in small towns and rural areas, serving customers who were already driving long distances for basic goods, and the conventional grocery chains that dominated American suburbs felt relatively insulated. They were wrong. Walmart's advantages in distribution, scale, and supply chain efficiency allowed it to sell groceries at prices that independent grocers and even large chains struggled to match. And as supercenters spread into larger markets through the 1990s and 2000s, the American grocery landscape shifted dramatically. Regional grocery chains that had operated for decades began closing. The concept of the neighborhood grocery store, one that was embedded in its community, knew its customers, and competed on service rather than volume, became harder to sustain in an economy where the lowest price was increasingly the only price that mattered. Walmart didn't just sell groceries cheaper, it changed what Americans thought grocery shopping was for. Walmart's supply chain was the decisive advantage, and it was built over decades with a seriousness of purpose that the grocery industry had not previously encountered from a competitor. The company's investment in logistics technology, its satellite-linked inventory system, its cross-docking distribution centers, its practice of requiring suppliers to adopt Walmart's data standards and delivery schedules rather than the reverse, produced cost efficiencies that were simply not available to conventional grocery chains working with older infrastructure and more fragmented supplier relationships. When Walmart sold a can of soup for less than the regional grocery chain, it wasn't because Walmart was willing to accept lower margins. It was because Walmart had eliminated costs that the regional chain was still paying. The price difference was real, and it was structural, and competing against it required either matching the infrastructure investment or finding some other reason for customers to choose you. The communities that felt Walmart's arrival most acutely were small and mid-sized towns, where a single regional grocery chain had served as the primary food retailer for years, sometimes generations. When a Walmart supercenter opened on the edge of town, accessible by car, offering lower prices, open 24 hours, stocking 10 times as many products, the downtown or neighborhood grocery often had years rather than decades before it closed. The closure of a grocery store in a small town is not a neutral event. It is the removal of a node in the community's social and economic infrastructure, a place where people encountered each other, where local products were sometimes sold, where employees had worked for years and sometimes their entire careers. The Walmart that replaced it offered lower prices and a parking lot the size of several football fields, and the trade-offs were real on both sides, and most communities found themselves unable to choose the expensive option once the cheap one was available. The Walmart grocery shopper of the 2000s was often a customer the existing grocery industry had been underserving, lower-income families for whom a meaningful price difference on staple goods represented a real improvement in household economics. The populist argument for Walmart's entry into the grocery market was genuine. It brought competition to markets that had sometimes been comfortably uncompetitive, reduced food costs for families who were spending a significant percentage of their income on groceries, and forced incumbent chains to become more efficient. The argument against was equally genuine. What it cost, in community infrastructure, in retail employment quality, in the survival of local and regional food businesses, was also real, and it was paid by people who often had no more choice in the matter than the grocery stores that closed. For most of the organic movement's history, the word organic was essentially unregulated. Any farmer or producer could use it to mean whatever they chose, and customers had to decide on trust, reputation, or the general vibe of the store selling the product. This created a market that was genuinely confusing. Some organic producers were small farms with rigorous standards and a philosophical commitment to soil health. Others were large operations using the word as a marketing term, with minimal practical difference from conventional production. The National Organic Programme, established through the Organic Foods Production Act of 1990 and fully implemented by 2002, created a federal certification standard that was supposed to clarify all of this. It mostly did, and it mostly didn't. The certification resolved certain questions about which synthetic pesticides and fertilizers were permitted, but it also created an industry large enough to attract the interest of major food corporations, who began acquiring organic brands, scaling up organic production, and introducing a category that had started as a rejection of industrial food into the industrial food system. Whether that was a victory for organic principles or their quiet defeat depended entirely on who you asked. The process of defining what counted as organic was, predictably, a political negotiation rather than a scientific one. The original proposal from the USDA in 1997 allowed for organic certification of food produced using sewage sludge as fertilizer, irradiation as a preservation technique, and genetically engineered ingredients, 3 practices that the organic community had uniformly rejected as incompatible with organic principles. The public comment period generated more than 275,000 responses, most of them objecting to these provisions, which was at the time the largest public response to any federal rulemaking in American history. The provisions were removed. The episode demonstrated both that the organic community was politically mobilized and that regulatory capture, the process by which the rules governing an industry are gradually shaped by the interests of the largest players in that industry, was going to be a persistent concern as the organic sector grew. The acquisition of small organic brands by large food corporations proceeded steadily through the 2000s. Cascadian Farm was acquired by General Mills. Odweiler went to Coca-Cola. Horizon Organic went to Dean Foods. Stonyfield Farm went to Danone. Each acquisition followed a recognizable pattern. The small organic brand had built a loyal customer base on the basis of values and quality. The large corporation bought the brand to access that customer base. The brand continued to operate largely independently, while benefiting from the parent company's distribution and marketing infrastructure. And the question of whether the product's quality and values had been preserved or gradually compromised was answered differently by different observers examining the same evidence. The grocery store organic label remained legally meaningful. The certification standards had not changed, but its cultural meaning had shifted considerably from the days when buying organic was a deliberate act of opposition to industrial food and the companies that produced it. The consumer standing in the organic aisle in 2015, comparing a bag of chips certified organic by a small regional producer with a bag certified organic by a brand owned by one of the largest food corporations in the world, was navigating a distinction the label did not capture. Both were certified. Both met the federal standard. What they represented in terms of the food system and the values it embodied was rather different, and the grocery store offered no particular guidance about which mattered more. The Food Network launched in 1993, and its initial programming was instructional and low budget, chefs demonstrating techniques, recipes explained step by step, cooking treated as a skill to be transmitted rather than a performance to be watched. Within a decade, that format had been largely overtaken by competition shows, celebrity chefs, travel programming, and the particular genre of food television that was less about teaching viewers to cook and more about making them feel something while watching someone else do it. The effect on the grocery store was measurable and strange. Ingredients that had been niche or specialty, arugula, shallots, balsamic vinegar, pancetta, became mainstream as viewers encountered them on television and then went looking for them at the store. Sales of certain products spiked reliably after a chef featured them on a popular program. The grocery store responded by expanding its specialty sections, its cheese counters, its prepared food departments, trying to serve a customer who now had opinions about food that went well beyond what their mother had cooked, even if they were rarely actually cooking those things themselves. Emeril Lagasse was probably the first television chef to function as a consumer product influencer in the modern sense, even though the term did not yet exist. His signature exclamation, "Bam!" entered the cultural vocabulary without anyone quite meaning for it to, and his enthusiastic deployment of garlic, onions, and the Creole spice blend he called Essence created a template for celebrity chef television that prioritized entertainment and personality over instruction. You watched Emeril not primarily to learn how to cook gumbo, but because he made cooking feel like a party you could attend from your couch. When the segment was over and the show went to commercial, you were not necessarily equipped to replicate what you had watched, but you were interested in the ingredients you had seen, and you looked for them at the store, and often you found them there because the grocery industry had been paying attention to the same television you were. The balsamic vinegar story is a useful illustration of the Food Network's grocery impact. In the mid-1980s, genuine aged balsamic vinegar from Medina was a specialty product available in Italian grocery stores and high-end food shops, known to a small number of cooks and largely invisible to the mainstream. As Italian cooking became fashionable on food television through the 90s and 2000s, a trajectory driven partly by Lidia Bastianich, Mario Batali, and a general cultural enthusiasm for rustic Italian food, balsamic vinegar appeared in kitchen after kitchen on screen, drizzled on salads, reduced into glazes, used in ways that made it look essential to a certain kind of competent domestic cooking. Grocery stores expanded their balsamic selections. Manufacturers introduced lower-priced versions. By 2005, a bottle of balsamic vinegar was in refrigerators that had never previously contained an Italian ingredient more adventurous than parmesan from a green cardboard tube. What the Food Network ultimately created was a vast audience of food-literate viewers who knew considerably more about ingredients, techniques, and cuisines than their parents had known, but who cooked from scratch considerably less often than the previous generation had. The knowledge expanded, the practice contracted. People watch cooking shows the way they watch travel shows, as an experience to be had vicariously, enjoyed in its own right, and only occasionally converted into actual action. The grocery store adapted by building out its prepared food sections and its deli counters, creating an aisle full of nearly ready dinners for the customer who had watched 4 hours of cooking television on Sunday and was reheating something on Monday. The Food Network taught Americans to want more from food. The grocery store figured out how to sell it to them without requiring them to cook. For most of the 20th century, grocery shopping was definitionally a physical act. You went to the store, you moved through it, you made decisions in real time, influenced by what you saw and smelled and picked up and put back down. The store itself was the experience, designed to be navigated slowly, to create accidental encounters with products you hadn't planned to buy. Online grocery shopping, which existed in limited form from the late 1990s onward, but became genuinely mainstream during the 2010s and exploded during the COVID-19 pandemic, dismantled that experience almost entirely. When you order groceries on an app, you are not shopping, you are selecting. You know exactly what you want. You search for it by name. It arrives. There is no wandering the cereal aisle at 10 at night because you wanted something salty and ended up with something sweet. There is no accidental encounter with a new cheese because it was sitting next to the one you always buy. The serendipity, the inefficiency, the gentle manipulation of the designed environment, all of it disappears. What replaces it is faster, cheaper, and entirely under your control. Whether anything is lost in that trade is a question the grocery industry is still trying to answer. The first serious attempt at online grocery delivery was Webvan, which launched in 1999 with ambitions so vast and capital requirements so enormous that it became one of the most spectacular failures of the dot-com era. Webvan raised over $800 million, built enormous automated warehouse facilities in cities across the country, and promised to deliver groceries to your door within a 30-minute window of your choosing. It declared bankruptcy in 2001, having spent most of its money on infrastructure before it had established whether sufficient numbers of customers actually wanted the service at the price point required to sustain it. The answer, in 2001, was no. Not because the idea was wrong, but because the broadband penetration, the smartphone adoption, and the consumer comfort with e-commerce that would eventually make online grocery viable simply did not yet exist. Webvan was correct about where things were going. It arrived approximately 15 years early and ran out of money waiting. Instacart, founded in 2012, solved the infrastructure problem Webvan had been unable to solve by not building any infrastructure at all. Instead of warehouses, it used existing grocery stores. Instead of employees, it used contractors, gig workers who shopped orders at partner stores and delivered them in their own cars. The model was asset-light in a way Webvan's had not been, and it scaled rapidly by piggybacking on the existing grocery supply chain rather than attempting to replace it. By the mid-2010s, major grocery chains were offering online ordering and curbside pickup as standard services, and the friction of the grocery run, the drive, the parking, the navigation of the store, the checkout line, was being progressively reduced toward the vanishing point. The pandemic of 2020 accelerated an adoption curve that had been climbing steadily and turned it nearly vertical. Grocery delivery went from a convenience chosen by the time-pressed to a necessity used by the cautious, and the habits formed under those conditions proved stickier than most behavioural predictions had anticipated. Customers who had never ordered groceries online before learned to do it out of necessity, and found that the convenience was real, and a meaningful percentage of them kept doing it after the necessity passed. The grocery store had survived the automobile, the refrigerator, the big box, and the organic movement. What it was now surviving was the possibility that its customers might stop coming in, that the carefully engineered environment, the produce section theatre, the bread smell at the entrance, the checkout lane temptations might simply cease to operate on a population that was increasingly interacting with the grocery store as a list on a screen rather than a place in the world. The store is still there. The question is how much longer it needs to be. The meal kit was invented to solve a problem that the grocery store had created and the Food Network had deepened. Millions of Americans who wanted to cook real food from scratch but stood paralysed every evening in front of a refrigerator full of ingredients they didn't know how to combine. Blue Apron launched in 2012, HelloFresh followed, and within a few years a category had emerged that offered something no grocery store had ever managed to provide. Not just the ingredients for a meal, but the specific, pre-portioned, exactly measured ingredients for a specific meal, accompanied by illustrated instructions simple enough that a person who had never julienned a carrot could do it on a Wednesday night without crying. The meal kit was not a grocery product. It was a grocery product plus a cooking class plus a dinner plan, delivered in a refrigerated box to a doorstep, and for a specific kind of busy, aspirational, Food Network adjacent household, it was almost exactly what was wanted. The grocery store watched this development with the particular attention of an institution that had just realised something it assumed was its exclusive territory had been quietly outflanked. The pre-portioned ingredient was the meal kit's central innovation, and its implications were more interesting than they appeared. When you buy groceries, you buy quantities. A bunch of thyme, a pound of ground beef, a bag of shallots, and the portion you actually need for tonight's dinner is a subset of what you purchased, leaving a remainder that sits in the refrigerator accumulating guilt until it goes bad and gets thrown away. The average American household wastes approximately 30% of the food it purchases, a figure so consistent across studies that it has become a baseline assumption in food policy discussions. The meal kit addressed this waste problem with elegant simplicity. You received exactly 2 tablespoons of tomato paste, not a tube of it with 20 tablespoons left over. You received 1 portion of salmon, not a side of it. The precision was partly about cost and partly about the experience of cooking without surplus, which turned out to feel satisfying in a way that grocery shopping rarely did. The grocery industry's response was swift and slightly anxious. Supermarkets began developing their own meal kit sections, pre-packaged ingredient kits available in the fresh food section, priced competitively with the delivery services, accessible without a subscription or a 2-day wait. Kroger acquired Home Chef. Albertsons acquired Plated. The grocery store was buying its way into a category that had emerged partly as a criticism of what the grocery store failed to offer: inspiration, simplicity, the confidence to cook something new on a Tuesday. Whether the in-store meal kit captured the same customer who would have subscribed to Blue Apron, or served a different customer who wanted the idea of the meal kit without the commitment of a subscription, was a question the industry debated while continuing to expand the section regardless. What the meal kit era revealed, more broadly, was that the grocery store's competitors were no longer other grocery stores. They were every possible configuration of food delivery, preparation assistance, and cooking inspiration that technology could produce and logistics could support. The meal kit competed not just with the grocery store but with the restaurant, the frozen dinner, the prepared food section, and the decision to simply not cook tonight and order something instead. The grocery store had spent a century learning to compete against other grocery stores. It was now competing against the entire landscape of how Americans fed themselves, a landscape that was expanding and fragmenting in ways that no single institution, however well designed and well stocked, could fully contain. After 100 years of transformation, from the corner store to the self-service market, from the suburban supermarket to the big box, from the organic aisle to the delivery app, it is worth pausing in the cereal aisle for a moment and asking what all of it actually produced. Not in terms of revenue or square footage or SKU count, but in terms of the people pushing the carts. What did the American grocery store make of the Americans who shopped in it? The answer is complicated in the way that all honest answers about large systems are complicated. which is to say it contains genuine achievements and genuine costs, and they are not easily separated from each other because they came from the same source. The supermarket fed people. It fed them more reliably, more affordably, and more abundantly than any food distribution system in human history had previously managed. It also, in the process, gradually dismantled some of what it replaced. The skills, the relationships, the seasonal knowledge, the daily rhythm of small transactions that had organised domestic life for generations, and it is not obvious that the trade was simple or that everyone came out ahead. The American family of 2020 could walk into a supermarket and choose from a selection of foods that would have been incomprehensible to their great-grandparents, 50 varieties of yogurt, a cheese section representing a dozen countries, fresh produce from every corner of the world, a freezer aisle containing complete meals from a dozen different culinary traditions, a pharmacy, a bank, a sushi counter, and a wall of vitamins organised by ailment. This abundance is real, and it matters. Food insecurity, the condition of not knowing reliably where your next meal is coming from, affects millions of Americans, and the existence of a dense, competitive, heavily stocked grocery infrastructure has reduced its scope compared to what it might otherwise be. The person who can reach a well-stocked supermarket and has sufficient income to shop there is eating better, in a narrow nutritional accounting sense, than most human beings who have ever lived. And yet the skills that the grocery store made unnecessary did not simply disappear when they stopped being practiced. They took knowledge with them, knowledge about what is in season and why it matters, about how to use the whole animal and the whole vegetable, about the relationship between the land and the table that had been embedded in daily cooking practice and was lost, quietly, as the supermarket made it irrelevant. The generation of Americans raised entirely within the supermarket era is the first in human history that required instruction, cookbooks, YouTube tutorials, meal kit cards to perform the basic act of preparing food from raw ingredients. That is a striking thing, and it is worth naming plainly, without nostalgia but also without pretending it is not a loss. The grocery store did not do this to Americans. Americans did this to themselves, with the grocery store's enthusiastic assistance, because convenience is a genuine good, and time is genuinely limited, and the demands of modern life are genuinely substantial. The store offered an easier way, and people took it, as people generally take easier ways when they are available. What sits at the end of all those easier ways, on the couch, in front of a screen, eating something from a box, is a person who is well fed in the caloric sense, and perhaps a little adrift in the culinary one, not hungry, not exactly satisfied. Scrolling through recipes they will probably not make, in a kitchen stocked with ingredients they are not quite sure how to use, in a house whose refrigerator is full, and whose pantry is abundant, and whose relationship with food is, at minimum, a work in progress, which is perhaps the most human ending possible for a 100-year story about what we eat and why. And so, here you are, at the end of a century of shopping carts and frozen peas and cereal mascots and checkout lane tabloids and organic certification debates and meal kits and delivery apps, and the slow, quiet disappearance of the butcher who knew your name. Think about what your great-grandmother carried home in her basket on a Tuesday morning in 1918. A pound of something from the butcher, a loaf from the bakery 2 blocks over. Whatever the garden had offered that week, she knew every ingredient by name, by season, by the person who sold it to her. Dinner was a daily negotiation between what existed and what she could make from it, conducted without a recipe app, a loyalty card, or 47 varieties of the same product competing for her attention on a shelf she had to drive to. And think about what you carried home this week. The sheer quantity of it, the geographical improbability of it, strawberries from one continent, olive oil from another, A spice that once cost more than gold, now sitting in a small jar in your pantry, next to 17 other small jars you bought with good intentions. The abundance is real. It is not nothing. People ate badly for most of human history, and the system that makes it possible for you to eat well without particularly trying is an achievement that deserves acknowledgement before it receives criticism. But somewhere between the corner store and the delivery app, something did get quieter. The daily transaction that was also a conversation, the seasonal rhythm that told you what time of year it was by what was on the table, the particular confidence of knowing exactly what to do with what you had, not because you had watched someone do it on television, but because you had done it yourself, and your mother had done it before you, and her mother before her, and the knowledge lived in your hands rather than in a search bar. The grocery store did not take these things from you intentionally. It simply offered easier alternatives, one at a time over the course of 100 years, and the easier alternatives were taken because they were easier, and that is a completely human thing to do. Nobody chose abundance over skill in a single decisive moment. It happened the way most large changes happen, gradually, in small increments, each one perfectly reasonable, the cumulative effect only visible from a distance. What the grocery store did give you, genuinely and without irony, is time. The hours not spent shelling peas, grinding grain, preserving the summer's surplus against the winter's scarcity. What you did with those hours is your own business, and history does not record whether they were spent wisely. But the hours were real, and they were a gift, even if the gift came wrapped in fluorescent lighting and a loyalty card that knows more about your eating habits than your doctor does. So tonight, as you lie in your comfortable bed in your well-heated house, within reasonable distance of a building where you can buy anything from kimchi to a birthday cake at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night, maybe spare a quiet thought for the woman with the basket and the Tuesday morning routine. For the Depression-era cook stretching a single piece of meat across 3 meals with the calm competence of someone who had no other option. For the farmer's wife who knew every vegetable she served by the specific patch of ground it came from. For everyone who fed their families before feeding a family was easy, and did it without complaint because complaint was not on the menu. They were stubborn, resourceful, occasionally covered in flour and almost certainly tired. They are also, in some meaningful sense, the reason dinner exists. Sleep well. The refrigerator is full. Someone worked very hard across a very long century to make sure of it.